Hi there and welcome back. In this video we're looking at a more advanced Python concept called typing. Python is what's known as a dynamic language. In a dynamic language, we don't specify what type of data a variable holds. For example, here we've got a cursor, and we're not saying that this cursor has to be a specific type like an integer or a string or a cursor object. In other programming languages, like Java for example, you would say cursor, this cursor has to be of type cursor, whatever class this is. But in Python you don't have to say that. Similarly, if you create a variable with the value 5, in Java you would have to say int x is 5, because that specifies that x has to be an integer at all times. And if you were to do this, you would get an error because the string 5 is not an integer. Java is a statically typed language, a language where you have to specify the type of variables as you create them. But Python is a dynamically typed language, which means you don't have to do that. It means you are a bit more flexible because your variable can change types between executions if you want. And also, there's a bit less code to write because you don't have to constantly define what every variable is. However, it also has some drawbacks. And the main drawback is that sometimes you can use a variable thinking it is one thing, but really it's something else. And you're not clear about that because you don't have anything that tells you what type it is. For example, if you have a variable called friends, and it's a tuple of your friends, at some point later on the program, maybe you forget it's a tuple, and down here you try to do friends.append something. Obviously this wouldn't work because you can't append on a tuple, but because you weren't seeing this code at that moment in time, you didn't realize that. That's one of the problems with dynamically typed languages like Python. So Python has introduced in Python 3 the concept of typing, where you can tell your editor, PyCharm, and some other third-party programs what your functions return and what your parameter types should be, so that when you're programming, it's a bit clearer what you're doing. Here's an example on how you might tell Python what your function returns. For example, this createBookTable returns none, and we know that because all Python functions return none by default if you don't include a return statement. So what can you do? You can tell Python that when you call this function, you expect it to return none. And you do this like so. After the function definition, but before the colon, you put this dash greater than none. Now when you go back to app.py, and you've got here database.createBookTable, you can say something like my variable equals that, but notice how now PyCharm gives you this squiggly line underneath and it says createBookTable doesn't return anything. Therefore, you probably don't want to assign it to a variable because that's pretty pointless, since the value is going to be none. If you remove the none, which you can do of course, it's totally optional, that now disappears because PyCharm is not aware that the function doesn't return anything. Okay, so again, you can include these type hints, that's what they're called, but they are not enforced by Python. These are only useful when you're developing in PyCharm or when you use a couple other pieces of software that will analyze your code and tell you when you are doing things like assigning a variable to a function that is meant to return none. When you run your program, Python completely ignores these type hints and it doesn't do anything with them. You won't get any errors for using them incorrectly or for assigning to a variable the return value of this function, even if it is none. So again, these are only just for you, and the most common use case is when you are developing with PyCharm, because PyCharm makes good use of these things. Okay, similarly the addBook function also returns none, so we can make it return none there. Now when you call the function, if you try to assign it to a variable, once again you'll get a wee message saying, hey, this function doesn't return anything, are you sure you want to do this? So that's for each function. Let's go and add a return value for each function in our database interface. I'm going to ignore the getAllBooks for now. We'll do this one at the end. So as you can see, all our functions return none. And we can add that in. Now we can go back to getAllBooks. And we can say that this is going to return a list of dicts, because it returns a list of dictionaries here. Of course, we get red squiggly lines because PyCharm doesn't know what these two are, so we have to go and import them. Whenever you want to import anything that's related to type hinting, like this here, we can import it from the typing module. This is new in Python 3.5. And there we have it. Now it's happy that it's returning a list of dictionaries. If you want, you can also tell it what each of the keys and values are. So you could say inside brackets str, which means string, this is the string class, for the keys, and str for the values. That would say that every key is a string and every value is a string. Now, of course, we know that the red status can be an integer. Therefore, we must do something else. We have to do that the keys can be strings. All of the keys are strings, name, author, and red, but the values are a union of string and integer. And again, we have to import this, of course, from the typing module. Now this says that this function returns a list of dictionaries where each key is a string and each value is either a string or an integer. Notice that's what the union does, and this is what the dict does. Now, in order to simplify, we can actually create our own types, which is pretty exciting. We can cut this code here. I'm going to cut it with Command X or Control X in Windows and say that it's going to return a list of books. Then we can go up to the top and say that book is what we cut earlier. A book type is a new type that is a dict of strings to strings or integers. And then down here we can use our new book type to simplify our code and make it a bit more explicit exactly what's going on. Notice that when you create a new type, because it's sort of like a class, even though it's not used as a class, you normally would give them a capital letter to begin with. This is just the convention. You can, of course, give them lowercase letters if you want, and that's totally fine. Okay, now that we've looked at return values, we can now look at the parameters. The name is going to be a string, so you'd think that we would do this. However, this dash and greater than is only used for return values. When you want to determine or define the type of a parameter, you use the colon here. Mildly confusing because the colon is normally used to signal the start of a block. This is one of the few times where you use a colon to determine something else. This and list slicing are two examples that come to the top of my head. Author is also going to be a string, so that's that. Notice that if you go over to appy into the add book function and you replace name by something that's not a string, like 5, PyCharm now gives you this yellow background that is not so readable. And it says expected type str.int. So it can help you when you're developing, but Python is not going to enforce this when you are coding. So if you do type 5 there and you run the program, you won't get any errors. You'll just input the name as 5 and then you get an error in SQLite because the type is defined as a text. Going back to database, we can do the same for any other functions that need parameters, like mark book as read, also a string, and delete book, also a string. Okay. Not too many of Python's libraries and projects and things like that use type hinting because it is quite new, but I can recommend using it in your projects. It will help you over time as your projects grow, and also it sort of gives you a bit more readability in terms of, okay, what's going to happen with the name here? It's a string, so probably going to use it as a string. Then you won't try to append things to it inside this function, for example. Indeed, if you try to do name.append, it'll tell you that this is unlikely. Unresolved reference append for class string. PyCharm now thinks that name is a string, even though it doesn't have any context on where it was defined. just because you said that it should be a string. So if you try to append something as if it were a list, it will tell you this is wrong. Of course, if you change this to a list, now you can do name.append, and notice how it already likes it and it tells you, hey, you can append here. Okay, so type hinting, pretty useful. Helps PyCharm, gives you good suggestions, and overall, as your apps grow, it's going to help them stay a bit more maintainable. So definitely a good thing to be doing. Feel free to do that for other functions in here, but the most important functions for you to do that in are those functions that you're going to call and receive values from. Your menus and things like that, probably not so important since nothing's calling them and they are not taking any parameters. So there's not much to define there. You could return the function, you could define that the function returns none, but because nothing's calling this function other than you up here, it doesn't matter much. I wouldn't worry too much about doing that. Okay, we can go over to the database connection, and we can also define that the enter method is going to return something. And what it's going to return is not a type from the typing module, but a type from the SQLite3 module. That's SQLite3.connection. Notice that the connection here is not a type per se, it is an actual class. It is something that you can create, and that indeed this connection gets created when you call SQLite3.connect. And that's fine. You can tell PyCharm that this is going to return a proper class. Totally cool. It doesn't have to be a type from the typing module. It doesn't have to be str or int. It can be an actual class that you have defined or that is defined in some other module. Now, when we go over to database.py, PyCharm will be able to advise us that the connection object has all these things from the SQLite module, which is pretty handy. Okay. So again, good for you, good for PyCharm, good for your projects as they grow. Definitely recommend that you do this. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you on the next one.